Overnight, from the 12th to the 13th of September 1942, Chuikov dealt with the commander of an armoured formation who had moved his headquarters from Hill 107.5 to the bank of the Volga. It's not specifically stated that it was Popov, but he's the most likely suspect since he was the only corps commander around. Chuikov got Popov on the telephone and asked him to explain himself, which the general attempted to do. Popov said that mortar fire, losses of men, and the instability of his units compelled him to withdraw his headquarters. This wasn't a satisfactory answer, and so Chuikov ordered Popov and his commissar to come to his headquarters. Face to face with the entire headquarters staff in the room, Chuikov asked them what they'd do if they were him and had to deal with them. They weren't able to answer because they were ashamed of their actions. Mirishka remembered how the atmosphere in the bunker was tense and sullen. No one really knew their new commander, and the officer wanted to justify himself. All around them, bomb explosions were reverberating as the enemy moved ever closer. I warned them in no uncertain terms that I considered theirs an act of cowardice and would regard any similar act in the future as treachery and desertion on the field of battle. I ordered them to have their command post back on Hill 107.5 by 4 AM. Mirishka says that Chuikov pointed to the map and said, "Here is my HQ on this side of the river, 800 meters from the Germans. Here is the position you will occupy 500 meters from the Germans." Jones says that everyone in the bunker suddenly understood the message, that they were all in this together and that they had to pull together in order to survive. Word of this meeting spread throughout the entire army, boosting the morale of the soldiers. Thus, by 4 AM, Popov was back in command of his unit to the west of the city. This was good because at 04:45 hours on the 13th of September 1942, the first German assault on the city of Stalingrad began. This is usually where all the books start their accounts about the Battle of Stalingrad, having skipped everything we've seen so far in this series. Which means that after 18 episodes talking about the Battle of Stalingrad, with just over 12 hours of content and 99,714 words at the end of this sentence, we have finally reached the beginning. So, with the intro out of the way, let's get on with it, shall we? The Germans proceeded their assault with an intense artillery bombardment and heavy air strikes, during which they dropped at least 856 incendiary bombs on the city, reportedly killing more than 300 civilians. A mass of Stukas came over us, and after their attack, one could not believe that even a mouse was left alive. The German bombardment was destructive, but because they didn't know where the Soviet positions were, it didn't do a lot of damage to their formations. The Luftwaffe also failed to attack the ferries crossing the Volga, allowing more supplies to slip into the city. The Soviets responded with heavy artillery and Katyusha rocket fire from the eastern bank of the Volga, but because they also didn't know where the enemy positions were, this fire support wasn't particularly focused. They did disrupt the German artillery though, and their fire was enough to slow the German advance. The aim of Zeilitz's 51st Army Corps was to march eastwards into Stalingrad with Wuttmann's 295th and Hartmann's 71st Infantry Divisions to move through the Red October village, Mamayev Kurgan, and the heights above the city centre. Yenika's 389th Infantry Division would push east as well, putting pressure on the base of the Orlovka salient. The ultimate aim of Zeilitz's corps was to break through to the Volga and split 62nd Army in half. Further south, Kemp's 48th Panzer Corps, with Broik's 24th Panzer, Pfeiffer's 94th Infantry, and Framery's 29th Motorized Divisions, aimed to move east, then north, through the southern parts of Stalingrad. The initial objectives were the clearance of the Minina, Yelshanka and Koporozhnoye suburbs, and the taking of Stalingrad's southern train station. So, how did this plan work out? Well, a fierce battle took place in the north, with Yenika's 389th Infantry Division inching forwards before being stopped by Andruseyenko's forces after taking parts of the railway line. Despite going almost nowhere, they lost 28 men killed and took 164 wounded, which shows just how much resistance Andrusienko was putting up against them. In heavy fighting, Wuttmann's 295th Infantry Division captured 2 hills in the area from the 23rd Tank Corps and the 112th Rifle Division's 524th Composite Regiment, now the size of a weak battalion, and compelled the Soviets to fall back towards the workers' villages. The 6th Army's diary describes the Soviet resistance as extremely stubborn, noting heavy Soviet artillery and mortars, some units fighting to the last man, plus counterattacks by others. Again, 295th Infantry Division suffered heavily, with 50 men killed, 234 wounded, and 2 missing. The Soviets managed this whilst suffering from the German artillery and from hunger. One account from the 112th Rifle Division reported that the troops had no field kitchen and had to boil the meat cut from a dead horse in order to feed themselves. Baktrakhov's 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade, 6th Tank Brigade, the 42nd Naval Rifle Brigade, and the Northern Regiment of Afanasiev's 244th Rifle Division were hit by Hartmann's 71st Infantry Division, which pushed them all back. The main focus, though, of the German attack was in the 194th Infantry Regiment's sector, which advanced along the railway line towards the Stalingrad airfield area, with the 518th Infantry Regiment of Wuttmann's division moving into the airfield itself to the north. In the process, the 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade was shattered. It had started the day with 1,500 men and ended it with 1,100. The 6th Tank Brigade also lost 13 of its tanks and was down to just 6 by the end of the day, although one source says it was down to 3. It does appear, though, that the 211th and 191st Infantry Regiments only made slight gains against the 42nd Naval Rifle Brigade and the Northern Regiments of the 244th Rifle Division, which 51st Army Corps reported on the next day were buttressed by armoured cupolas and tank turrets. But clearly, Zeilitz's offensive had brought the Soviet line ahead of them to the brink of collapse. This is the line at the start of the day, and this is the line at the end of the day. It's fair to say that they had moved a significant distance in the centre. Further south, though, Kemp's forces made only minor gains, as stubborn Soviet opposition blunted the 24th Panzer Division and 94th Infantry Division's progress. The north wing of the 24th Panzer Division had advanced only around 100 metres before getting pinned down in front of a line of bunkers, suffering 26 men killed in action and 84 wounded as a result. 94th Infantry Division just about reached the western outskirts of Minina and Yelshanka, but suffered 66 men killed and 183 men wounded, going a distance that was just a few metres. Fremery's 29th Motorized Division managed to capture the area southwest of Yelshanka from the 131st Rifle Division, but they lost 30 men killed and 85 men wounded doing so. Overall, Kemp's men went almost nowhere, which is a testament to the determination of the Soviet defenders at this stage. Somewhere in this area was a Soviet nurse who described how her political officer and several signallers were killed by German artillery. Shortly afterwards, the Germans started throwing grenades into her dugout.
I could hear the German voices around the dugout. I was afraid the Germans would rape me. I pulled out my revolver and put the muzzle to my temple. I could already feel the touch of the steel when I realised that it was preposterous for a strong, healthy person to end their own life. I put my revolver back in its holster. Then a German officer jumped into the dugout. He started picking up map cases, weapons and compasses. When he spotted me, his eyes widened. Vipe, woman, he said, and made a grab at my chest. I pushed his hands away. Vipe, I said, and told him to stop touching me. I took off my map case and handed over my revolver. He was especially pleased with the map case.
That evening, though, Kempf received the audience of a new officer, General Major Arno von Lenski, who had been the commander of a school for armoured and motorised units in Kremnitz. Lenski was the new replacement commander for the 24th Panzer Division, since Hauenschelt had been wounded and Broik had only been given temporary command. Interestingly, I was told that the OKW had scheduled 24th Panzer Division to be pulled out of the fighting around Stalingrad as soon as possible, and together with a motorised division be employed in the advance on Baku. Given future events, it's probable that the motorised division would have been the 29th Motorised Division, but it's interesting to note that the OKW was optimistic enough to think that the Battle of Stalingrad would be over quickly enough for 24th Panzer Division to be shifted south and take Baku this year. Reviewing the field of battle, it was Seydlitz's corps that did the most damage, with the 189th and 27th Tank and 6th Guards Tank Brigades losing 32 tanks and 250 men on this day alone. 6th Guards Tank Brigade now only had 4 T-34s and 2 T-70s left, and the others were in a similar state. The Soviets lost a total of 41 tanks in the whole of 23rd Tank Corps, with Popov going on to claim to have killed or wounded 1,260 German troops and destroyed 41 tanks or assault guns, which is a wildly exaggerated claim. The 295th Infantry Division that it faced only lost 286 men on this day, and the 6th Army reported that Seydlitz still had 26 Stugs in operation by the end of the day. It's not clear how many Stugs they lost, but it was something like 2 or 3 permanent losses, with a few more taken out but repairable, not 41. There were no tanks in this area as far as I can tell, and not all of the Stugs here were operating against the 23rd Tank Corps. And while we're on the subject of Stugs, 51st Army Corps is fighting despite a lack of ammunition for assault guns and heavy mortars, which the army has not received. But the lack of Stug and mortar ammunition seems to have been made up by the substantial amount of artillery ammunition available to the Germans. The favourable development of events for the Germans can be explained in no small degree by their powerful artillery support. In total, the 6th Army expended 760 tons of ammunition on 13th of September, which is something of a record for almost the entire preceding period. By the mid-afternoon, the German artillery and air barrage had cut the above-ground telephone wires that Chuikov was using to communicate with his subunits. He was now out of contact with most of his subordinates and was forced to rely on runners. This failure in communications so frustrated Chuikov that he lashed out at who he thought was the communications officer.
There was an NKVD officer, Konstantin Danilin, passing through the HQ. Chuikov mistook him for the communication officer and whacked him with his stick.
Yes, I was hit by Chuikov. Apparently he thought I was someone else. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tensions were clearly high. Having only just taken up command of the army, Chuikov seems to have been surprised by how weak his units were, with Krylov describing that the divisions that appeared on their maps and reports weren't really divisions but mere shadows of their former selves. Despite this, Yeremenko now decided to order Chuikov to conduct a counterattack along with Shumilov against the Germans. Neither Chuikov nor Shumilov had the forces to mount the counterattack that Yeremenko was proposing, and Falk says that Shumilov may not have even attacked at all, but orders were orders, and so Chuikov started making preparations. That evening, Chuikov ordered that his counterattack was to begin at 0330 hours on the 14th of September, with the aim being to throw back 51st Army Corps' penetration in the centre of the city. The units to take part were the 38th Motorised Rifle Brigade, the 272nd NKVD Regiment, which was moved up from the reserve, and the Composite Regiment of the 399th Rifle Division with 6th Tank Brigade attached. Even with 3 additional anti-tank regiments, 3 additional artillery regiments, and 3 additional Katyusha rocket artillery regiments allocated to this action, This attack wasn't going to do much, and even Chuikov knew this. We were not counting on any rapid victory, but on surprising the enemy and upsetting his plans. Chuikov also realised that he couldn't command his troops without proper communications, which were constantly getting cut in the Mamayev-Kurgan area. The German bombardment had been so bad that the telephonists themselves had been compelled to climb out of their bunkers in the middle of the explosions to try and fix the lines. And a bomb had blown up the cottage where the cooks had been preparing Chuikov's breakfast, with another mortar bomb destroying the field kitchen that was then trying to prepare dinner for the headquarters. After that, our cook decided not to bring out any more food to no purpose and simply left us to go hungry. Unable to stomach this situation anymore, Chuikov decided to move his headquarters overnight to the Zaritsa bunker, which was located near the Zaritsa Balka and the central landing stage. It's worth noting that Yeremenko had given the army permission to move its headquarters a few days before, so this technically wasn't a violation of Order Number 227. This bunker was much better than Krylov's dirt dugout, and had a roof that was over 10 yards thick, which would provide Chuikov more protection. However, on his way there that evening, his vehicle became tangled in telephone wires and was brought to a halt. It took a few minutes to sort the situation out, and bombs started exploding around them. Nobody was hurt, but I am counting this as another near-death experience for Chuikov, bringing the total to 9. Chuikov had survived again, but would his luck continue? Considering that the struggle for Stalingrad would become ferocious, you might assume that the Soviets had turned the city into some sort of fortress city. They had constructed defence lines, so maybe they did the same in the city as well, right? Well, on the 13th of September, Major General Knyazev reported that only 25% of the defence works in Stalingrad had been completed. There were no anti-tank ditches, and the anti-tank defences as a whole were lacking. Most barricades that needed to be erected hadn't been, and mines also needed to be laid. And Chuikov himself reported that those barricades that were erected could be knocked over easily with the bumper of a lorry. So Stalingrad certainly couldn't be considered a fortress city, which may have contributed to Halder's impression that the city would fall in 10 days. With the city certain to fall soon, on the 13th of September, Hitler issued new instructions to address the problems at Stalingrad. One of these instructions was that, if the Soviet defences north of Stalingrad weakened suddenly, German forces should attack northwards with 14th Panzer and 8th Army Corps and defeat the enemy. This plan was codenamed Operation Autumn Crocus. After this, Army Group B was also ordered to launch an immediate pursuit to the east, and this was to be done by Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, which wouldn't have 48th Panzer Corps unless Stalingrad fell, meaning that Hoth would only have one weak Panzer Division, the 14th, and a few German and Romanian infantry divisions to get to Astrakhan. The 6th Army would get a bit of relief when Stalingrad fell, since some of the units in Stalingrad could be pulled out of it and moved to the north. But otherwise, the bridgeheads on the Don were still not seen as the priority at this point. It also shows how stretched the Axis were in this campaign. They didn't have enough units to reach the objectives that they already had, yet were being asked to go much, much further. Clearly, the order to split Army Groups A and B and send them in different directions had caused this issue, as had the logistical problems and the lack of replacements coming from Germany. Apparently, Zhukov also came to this conclusion on this day, although this is certainly debatable because the way he describes it, talking about how the Germans were fighting inside Stalingrad, which they weren't at this point, suggests that it wasn't until later that he came to this conclusion. There were some German replacements though. To the north of the city, there was now a lull in the fighting as a result of the failure of Zhukov's first Kotlebane offensive. This respite allowed the 160th Panzer Battalion time to repair a number of its panzers, and they also received a batch of new tanks as well, bringing their total tank number to 37 panzers. The 103rd Panzer Battalion would also receive 93 replacements on the next day, the 14th, which would bring the battalion back up to full strength in terms of personnel. The maintenance unit busied themselves repairing the tanks, but the supply services were failing to provide the necessary parts and engines, and so they had no choice but to take parts from some damaged panzers to keep the other ones operational. And on the Soviet side of the wire, Stalin complained, "Tens and hundreds of thousands of Soviet people are giving their lives in the fight against fascism, and Churchill is haggling over 20 Hurricanes, and those Hurricanes aren't that good, our pilots don't like them." Now it's time to address an issue I hinted at last time. According to Zhukov and Vasilevsky, the two generals spent this day working on a new plan of action. "We concentrated on the possibility of a large-scale operation that would enable us to avoid squandering our prepared and half-prepared reserves on isolated operations. In October, we should be completing the formation of the strategic reserves. By that time, our industry would have substantially increased its output of the latest types of aircraft and of ammunition for the artillery." According to Zhukov, when they met with Stalin, they presented him with their concept for a new counter-offensive. They recommended that no action should be taken until October, but that the Red Army continue to conduct an active defence to bleed the enemy to death. What's interesting though is this sentence in Zhukov's memoirs. "As for the specific plan of the counter-offensive, we could not, of course, work out all the details in one day, but we clearly saw that the main blows must be struck at the flanks of the Stalingrad concentration, which was covered by Romanian troops." On the next page, Zhukov talks about the other Axis allies being on the flank and notes how weak they were compared to the German formations. Which is true. But again, he mentions the Romanians. Well, this is incorrect because the flanks weren't covered by Romanian troops yet. There were some Romanian troops in the 4th Panzer Army, but the Romanian 3rd Army was still in the Caucasus and hadn't moved to the Don flank yet. Antonescu only asked Hitler to withdraw the Romanians from the Caucasus on the 22nd and 23rd of September. And while some Romanian units did arrive at the Don slightly earlier than that, the 3rd Romanian Army couldn't have been said to have been on the Don before late September at the earliest. There's a German map showing the very first elements of the Romanian 5th Army Corps arriving at the Don on the 13th of September. And these were the very first elements of the Romanian 3rd Army to move to the area. So, if the plan was developed as a way to smash through the Romanian lines, it couldn't have been thought up on the 13th of September because the Romanian lines hadn't formed yet. We clearly saw that the main blows must be struck at the flanks of the Stalingrad concentration, which was covered by Romanian troops. Well, he clearly didn't because there clearly weren't any Romanians there, and clearly this is the part he remembers most about the early conception of the plan because he clearly states that he clearly remembers it, which supports the idea that Zhukov's account is clearly false. Zhukov also says that they'd have enough forces to start the operation in 45 days' time. Well, again, this places the start date in late October when it actually happened in mid-November, suggesting that they only came up with the idea for the plan later. Now, as I said last episode, there's other evidence too that Zhukov didn't come up with the plan at this time. For example, Anton Jolly said that neither Zhukov nor Vasilevsky visited the Kremlin in this period, which Isayev confirms in his book. So I'm not just basing this on one slip of the pen. But it should be clear to you that this other solution business didn't happen at this time. It must have happened later than mid-September 1942. And this should make you wonder why Zhukov would say that he and Vasilevsky came up with the plan in mid-September. Was it just a slip-up in his memoirs? Was it something else? We'll find out later. For now, all we need to know is that the only counter-offensive on the books was the next Kotlebane offensive, plus Churykov's counterattack in the city of Stalingrad itself. Let's see how he does. At 03:30 hours on the 14th of September 1942, Churyakov launched his counterattack as ordered by Yeremenko. But Makov's 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 272nd Regiment of 10th NKVD Division, and the Composite Regiment of 399th Rifle Division, with 6th Tank Brigade attached, had been reinforced with a bunch of extra anti-tank and artillery units. Churyakov had hoped that Samadaya's 92nd Rifle Brigade would have crossed the Volga by now to join the attack as well, but Yeremenko didn't release the 92nd Rifle Brigade in time, so the other units had to launch the attack without it, which they did, without much luck. At first, the sheer audacity of Churyakov's counterattack took 51st Corps, 295th and 71st Infantry Divisions off stride. Once the sun rose, however, attacks by multiple groups of up to 60 Stuka aircraft and well-aimed artillery fire brought the Soviet assault to an abrupt halt. Bergstrom confirms that it was mainly Stuka support that blunted Churyakov's attack. He also notes that the Germans lost 5 aircraft this day, while the Soviets lost 29. One of the German planes that came down was rammed by a Soviet Yak-1, yet the Soviet pilot managed to survive and later posed for a picture beside the wreckage of the German fighter. As Churyakov's attack failed, in the south, the 2 southern divisions of Kemp's 48th Panzer Corps moved into the city. At first, the 29th Motorcycle Battalion and the 15th Infantry Regiment of 29th Motorized Division advanced in the southern part of the city, with the 276th Infantry Regiment on their northern flank, the 267th above that, and the 274th closer to Minina. The Motorcycle Battalion was the first to reach the Volga, but was followed by the spearheads of 15th Motorized Regiment a few hours later. However, the main part of the regiment became embroiled in a fight with Dubyansky's 35th Guards Rifle Division, and so the spearheads became cut off for a while. To get things going again, 2 battalions from the 71st Motorized Regiment were formed into a combined battalion called the Mollin Battalion and sent to the area east of the railway line. With their help, the 15th Motorized Regiment turned northwards and advanced with Mollin and the 276th Infantry Regiment towards the Yelshanka Balka. But when the 276th Infantry Regiment got hit in the flank in the Yelshanka area, this stalled the entire attack. The Mollin Battalion ended up in house-to-house fighting, and the 15th Motorized Regiment got bogged down in the factory next to the railway, and so they failed to reach the Yelshanka Balka. Fremery therefore sent the 7 Panzers of 129th Panzer Battalion to assist the 276th Infantry Regiment, hoping to get the advance going again. At 1800 hours, Kuparosnaya was still being mobbed up while fighting raged in the factory. The factory was only declared enemy-free at 0600 hours the following morning. So, the Germans hadn't gotten very far in the south before their attack had come to a halt. The Soviets, especially the Guardsmen, had put up stiff resistance and had blunted the advance. But it was in the centre of the battlefield that the main events took place, as 51st Army Corps resumed its advance, preceded by a heavy artillery bombardment and Stuka attacks. Batrakov's 42nd Naval Rifle Brigade was smashed by all 3 of Hartmann's regiments and was compelled to fall back into the city. It's worth noting though that the 191st Infantry Regiment couldn't overcome the defensive line in the south, with the Soviets using armoured cupolas and tank turrets to blunt the attack. At the same time, to the north, the 295th Infantry Division, with its 518th Infantry Regiment on its southern wing, also moved southeastwards and took the western slopes of Mamayev Kurgan. In the book Stalingrad, How the Red Army Triumphed, which is a great book, highly recommended, Jones explains that Churyakov had ordered that all Soviet heavy artillery be shipped to the east bank of the Volga. This makes sense because they were struggling to ship supplies across the Volga anyway, and artillery can just as easily fire from the east bank as it can from the west bank. So in that sense, there's no issue. The problem is that the soldiers saw the withdrawal of the artillery and mistakenly believed that the army was about to pull out of the city. When our troops saw the artillery being shipped to the far bank of the Volga, everyone took this as a sign that Stalingrad was about to be abandoned. This terrible moment has been exercised in our history books, no one talks about it, but removing the artillery triggered an alarming collapse in morale. Jones then states that Chuikov gave orders for a counterattack to be made on Mamayev Kurgan, but that his orders were ignored. Worse, panicked soldiers abandoned their posts and fled. This perhaps explains why the 269th Regiment of the 10th NKVD Division failed to do its job and collapsed back under the pressure. Looking at the official reports, Isayev is unable to explain why this unit and others fell back, but perhaps the drop in morale brought on by the withdrawal of the artillery would explain this. The drop in morale also explains why the 112th Rifle Division fell back too. Yes, only 2 shattered regiments from the division were on Mamayev Kurgan at this point, and they only had a total of 271 men for both regiments, so they could hardly be described as one company, let alone 2 regiments. Still, the 416th Regiment's left flank was turned, and thus it fell back to the northeastern slopes of Mamayev Kurgan. Again, by itself, this seems reasonable. It was outflanked and pushed back. But then we hear that the regiment leader was relieved of command and replaced by a Captain Asiev. This suggests that these units didn't fall back under pressure, but actually abandoned the hill, prompting the dismissal of the regiment commander. Obviously I can't verify this, but it would make sense if this was the case. No matter what happened here, the Germans played their part, causing chaos on the Soviet side, as a soldier from the 112th Rifle Division describes. The awful cacophony of sound was swelled by enemy artillery and mortar fire. Everything around us was roaring and burning. The Germans managed to hit our transport vehicles, and everything went up in flames. Our losses were mounting all the time. The conditions were absolutely horrific. A shell exploded next to Fortov, who was carried off the field of battle wounded. Worse, the news of the loss of Mamayev Kurgan caused a massive drop in Soviet morale, in addition to that felt by the withdrawal of the artillery. When the Germans took control of the Kurgan, panic broke out amongst our soldiers. It spread to unit after unit. We found ourselves losing control of the army. With the 112th Rifle Division and the 269th Regiment of the 10th NKVD Division falling back, this allowed the 194th Infantry Regiment to advance into the city streets and then rapidly strike towards the Volga. When the soldiers reached the city outskirts and disappeared between the wooden houses and gardens, a real inferno from salvos of Stalin organ rockets caused the whole suburban settlement to disappear in a wall of fire and smoke. Nonetheless, the Germans moved quickly through the streets, facing little resistance, although casualties began to mount. Lone snipers took potshots at them from multi-story buildings, and Soviet artillery took its toll. And because the resistance in other areas wasn't that great, the 2 battalions of 194th Infantry Regiment were given a company of Stugs as backup. I, with my strong will, impulse and daring, wanted to reach the Volga and maintain the combat momentum. Soon I was at the lead element, which had just entered the residential area. I was able to establish that enemy resistance was weak, and it seemed the same further on. Wooster was ordered to follow up behind the infantry and set up an observation post as a forward artillery observer. His unit set up on the outskirts of the city, along with the rest of the artillery regiment, as he moved through the airfield and then into the suburbs. The buildings were more or less abandoned, although a few women rushed to leave the city with their children in tow. Katyusha rockets blasted them several times, and they lay out in the street under the hail. Without cover on the road, we lay amongst them, but still nothing happened to us. Because the propulsion charge was mounted in the tip of the rocket, the fragmentation effect of the actual explosive charge was directed upwards in a cone-shaped way and did not spray shrapnel along the ground, as is the case with normal artillery rounds when equipped with impact fuses. Even so, their overall impact still terrified us, even though they were less dangerous than they first appeared. We actually got quite used to them. Worcester spent the night in this building here, which was a bathhouse that had a concrete roof and was being used as a makeshift hospital when Worcester first entered it. The roof was impervious to Katyusha fire, making them feel quite safe, for now. Further east, the 194th Infantry Regiment made decent progress against little resistance. My estimation of the enemy turned out to be right, so I was in good spirits, for there was no significant resistance and only occasional artillery fire from the other side of the Volga. Finally, we reached the railway station. The Germans managed to seize Stalingrad Central Railway Station at 2 PM, and the German Reconnaissance Battalion reached the fallen fighters' square, where they were fired upon by the staff from 62nd Army's headquarters unit. Churikov describes this action by saying that drunken German infantry jumped down from their lorries and started dancing in the street, thinking that they'd won the city. This vision might be true. The 71st Infantry Division wasn't a motorised unit, but the Reconnaissance Battalion may have had some trucks and armoured personnel carriers, so this could have happened. Either way though, this advance was rapid, and it certainly looked as though the city was about to fall. Even just looking at the map, this is clearly a disaster for the Soviets. There's no doubt that Churikov was caught by surprise by 71st Infantry Division's rapid advance. He now scrambled to find anything to plug the gap and stop the Germans from reaching the Volga, or his command post, which was just 800 meters away from the German lines. Apparently, at this time, one of the German vehicles drove towards one of the bridges over the Zaritsa Balka, but was destroyed by a mine. If the Soviets didn't stop them soon, 62nd Army's headquarters could be overrun, and Churikov himself might be captured. That's why they had no choice but to throw everything they had left at the Germans. Then, all of a sudden, everyone stopped and took cover. Something unexpected happened. There was confusion. Then the sight of T-34s crossing to and fro, the mortars, machine guns, and enemy artillery observers disembarked and marked the beginning of the end. Churikov had thrown Kopka's 6th Tank Brigade into the fight, and its T-34s went head-to-head with several German Stugs. In the end, the Soviets claimed to have knocked out 6 German assault guns. It's not clear if they did or not, but they ended the day with just 3 T-34s left. At the same time, elements of 10th NKVD Division and local militia units were also committed against the 194th Infantry Regiment. This included the dogs of 28th Detachment of Tank Destroyer Dogs, who went into action and reportedly caused confusion in the German ranks. And Churikov's Chief of Staff, Krylov, scraped together 2 small groups of headquarters staff and 9 KV tanks from Skuba's 6th Guards Tank Brigade and sent them against the Germans. These actions did slow the 194th Regiment in the afternoon, but even so, the Germans pressed on through the ruined buildings towards the Volga and the central landing stage. This is a picture of 2 soldiers from the 194th Infantry Regiment from the 71st Infantry Division in the centre of Stalingrad on the 14th of September 1942. Note that the city was already in ruins even at this stage of the fighting. With his defences collapsing, Churikov summoned Colonel Sarayev to speak to him, but Krylov warned Churikov that the NKVD commander didn't like carrying out the army's orders, and up to this point, the 10th NKVD Division had operated independently from the 62nd Army's command, which obviously undermined the cohesion of the defence, and at this critical juncture this had to stop. So, Churikov told Yeremenko that he was going to take control of the NKVD within Stalingrad because he, as the army commander, should have total authority in the city. Yeremenko agreed, and armed with this authority, when Zarayev arrived at Chuikov's headquarters, Chuikov asserted it over Zarayev. Do you understand that your division has been incorporated into the 62nd Army and that you have to accept the authority of the Army Military Command? This was a crucial moment because technically the NKVD weren't subservient to the Red Army, and Zarayev could have taken matters into his own hands. In fact, Beria had threatened to kill a commander in the Caucasus for daring to suggest that his NKVD troops should be commanded by the army. This is perhaps why Zarayev started to grumble to Chuikov about having to take orders from him, at which point Chuikov threatened the NKVD commander with a reprimand. Do you want me to telephone the front military council to clarify the position? Zarayev didn't, realizing that the Kremlin didn't have his back, and Zarayev submitted to Chuikov. I understand. I am now a soldier of the 62nd Army. Chuikov therefore ordered the leader of the 10th NKVD division and other local militia units to get away from the front line and start selecting solid buildings in the city centre to fortify. The idea behind this was so that the policemen didn't get in the way of the regular army units, allowing them to fight and to build up a stronger defence in depth. Obviously this would take time to implement, so NKVD units continue to fight on the front lines for now. But Zarayev was ordered to start placing 50 to 100 men in each strongpoint with a commissar in charge of each group. And this Zarayev started to do. Kopka then came in to see Chuikov and reported that his last tanks had been immobilized. He still had 100 men though, armed with submachine guns and pistols, so Chuikov ordered him to defend the central landing stage. In this desperate situation, Chuikov learned that the commander of the 1345th Rifle Regiment of the 399th Rifle Division, a Major Zhukov, and his commissar, Raspopov, had abandoned their regiment and fled. This was unacceptable, so Chuikov ordered them to be shot in front of their troops as a way of instilling fear and discipline in his men. He clearly couldn't afford for his officers to abandon their units at such a critical time during the battle. Chuikov also met Lopatin, who was thoroughly depressed by this point and who thought the situation was hopeless. Chuikov told him to leave. His feeling of depression had undoubtedly communicated itself to his subordinates, of which fact I was soon convinced when, on the pretext of illness, 3 of my deputies for artillery, tanks and army engineering left for the opposite bank of the Volga. It's understandable why Lopatin thought the situation was hopeless though. The Germans were almost at the Volga and had almost cut the 62nd Army in 2. There was almost nothing left to stop them, although that didn't stop the Soviets trying. Worse, it seems that the 62nd Army was running out of ammunition. Not enough was getting shipped across the Volga, and they only had enough for another day's fighting. Beaver states that train station number 1 changed hands 4 times, apparently 3 times in the morning, only to be retaken by an NKVD battalion in the afternoon. Colonel Adam recalls that the train station changed hands 5 times, and Glantz confirms this by reporting that the government buildings, train station number 1 and Red Square, changed hands at least 5 times throughout the 14th of September. Whatever the number, in the end, the Soviets couldn't stop the German infantry supported by Stugs, who continued to advance towards the Volga that afternoon. And at 15:15 hours, Hinderlang's 1st Battalion captured the houses of engineering specialists and nearby buildings. Then, under cover of the buildings, a mortar company was deployed, machine gun nests were dug in, and artillery spotters were set up on the upper floors. They were literally a few meters away from the Volga and could see the water, and all that stood in their way were a handful of men from the 79th Border Guards Regiment and 115 cadets who were hanging on by their fingernails. Nearby, Münch's 3rd Battalion was getting closer to the Volga as well. So eager were they to reach the river that they apparently started shouting, "The Russians will drown in the Volga." Captain Gerhard Mensch personally led the 3rd Battalion, 194th Infantry Regiment as it tried to cross several city blocks and gain the riverfront. Mensch thought their chances of reaching the Volga before nightfall were excellent. With the Germans on the bank overlooking the Volga, the situation was critical for the Soviet 62nd Army. The fate of Stalingrad now hung in the balance. The question is, though, how on earth could Chuikov stop the Germans? We'll find out next time. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.